All right, so in this video, we're going to be looking at how we can further extend our custom path drawing tool inside of Unreal using the Houdini engine by adding interactive handles to our splines that we can control while in the spline editing mode, and then have that automatically cook the updates to our terrain paths. So inside of the scriptable tools mode inside of Unreal, if we open our tool once more, we're going to look at something we haven't touched on yet, which is the concept of a gizmo, which is the transform, rotate, and scale gizmo. So you can see that we can create gizmos. We can also destroy gizmos. And I think as well, if we go to overridable events, we can see that there's an overridable function on the scriptable tool called on gizmo transform changed. Okay. So what we want to do now is we basically want to create the behavior for when we want to create a TRS gizmo, and the behavior for when we move that TRS gizmo. What impact is that going to have on the splines that drive our pathfinding system? So first of all, let's look at how we can create a TRS gizmo. So the way that I want to deal with the creation of TRS gizmos is I basically want to find one of the existing splines in the scene, and I want to select that, set that as my active spline that's currently being controlled, and then I want to create a gizmo for each control point. So let's go into the tool and see what we can do. So I want this to be driven by the selection, and I want it to be driven by the currently selected actor. So let's go for get selected assets or get selected actors. Okay, so important distinction. Get selected assets is going to grab the assets that are selected in the content browser. So that's this menu down here. And selected actors is going to grab the return what is currently our active selection in the world. Sorry, I keep showing you behind the scenes there of my video editing. So I'm just going to make sure that's a bit further back. So we're going to get the selected actors, and I want to make sure that we're only getting one. We don't want to select more than one at a time. And I want to then I want to make sure that this is the currently selected spline. So I'm going to say cast to BP spline. Okay. And then on the BP spline, we're going to get the spline. Let's have a little look, or get spline points, get number of spline points. There we go. And then I'm going to we're going to do a for loop. There we go. Or maybe there's a last spline point index. So last spline point or spline point. Let's have a little look. Okay, well, get number of spline points. So we want to subtract one from this. There we go. Because we're talking about indices, which counts up from 0. And then we're going to get the location at spline point. Okay, so it's probably a bit unfamiliar for non-Unreal users coming from Houdini, but useful stuff to know nonetheless. And we're going to then make that transform from that location. It's going to be in world space. I'm going to split that struct pin to control the gizmo options. And I don't care about rotation. I don't care about scale. Okay, don't care about scale. And there we go. Don't want any snapping. We want it to be world space. Okay, in terms of the translation, I only want it to, well, we can leave this as it is for now. Okay, so we'll come back to this in a bit. Oh, we set it to translation only up here. Okay, so let's have a little recap. So we're getting selected actors. We're going to get the first actor. We're going to check that it's a spline. If it is, we're going to do this. If not, we're going to do nothing. We're going to then loop over the spline points. And for each spline point, we're going to add a gizmo. And we're going to need to give each gizmo a unique name. Otherwise, this won't work. So we're going to have to create a list of gizmos. Okay. So let's go ahead and promote this to a variable. I'm going to make sure that it's an array. I'm going to call this array, this string array, an array of gizmos array. Let's see what happens if I just type in gizmos. Maybe I can just get gizmos by default. No, I can't. Okay, so getting the array of gizmos, and we're going to make sure that the identifier, so we're going to add to the array of gizmos whenever we create a new TRS gizmos, we're going to add to the array of gizmos, and we're going to get the length. Okay, so then we're going to call all of the gizmos. So we're going to append. We're going to set the current gizmo identifier to be gizmo and the name. So the number, sorry. So this means that every time we add a gizmo to the array, we're going to increment the name. So gizmo 0, gizmo 1, gizmo, because when we have no gizmos in the array, the length will be 0. So that means the first gizmo will be called gizmo 0. And we have one element in the array, then we're going to have gizmo 1. All right. So there we go. So now we're creating all of our gizmos. And this is going to be based off of the selected actors. So tell you what, actually, let's not do it over the selected actors. Let's just run straight over all of the splines. So we're going to get curve inputs. We go. So this maybe is a better way to do it. And then we can actually just do we're going to have to do a for each loop over a for each loop. That's the thing here. So yeah, let's just deal with it this way for the time being. So let's actually just grab the first input again, get the spline from it, and then we're going to loop over it and create the gizmos for all of them. Okay, so this is going to definitely live inside of a function. So right click, collapse to function. I'm going to call this create gizmos from spline. Okay. And then we're going to move this up. And just for the time being, let's do this immediately after setting of the curve inputs. Okay. So let's see what happens. We've run the tool. Oh, we have an issue. Can't pass default value in the gizmos array. Just had to recompile again. Okay. So now let's go ahead and run the tool, and voila. Straight away, we can see that the gizmos have already been created on the spline that we provided. Okay. And if I pull them, I can move them around, but we can obviously see that right now nothing is happening, and that's fine because we haven't configured the behavior. If we run the tool again, we get the gizmos, we close the tool, the gizmos are gone. So you can see how nicely that was already working. Okay, so we are creating the gizmos based off of a spline, and at the moment, it's just grabbing the first spline. And we don't want to grab the first spline, we just want to grab a spline. So let's just wire this spline into the input of the function there. So that means that it's nice and modular and reusable. Okay, so now we have create gizmos from spline. And if we wanted this to do it for every spline now, we could just do a little for each loop like so. Dun, da, da. Okay, so now it's going to create a gizmo for each of those splines. And check if this is true by running the tool. And there we have it. We now have gizmos for all of our splines. So how do we go about sort of setting this up to actually move the splines around? Well, it's slightly involved, but we're going to get there in the end. So let's go back over to here and let's just make a bit more space and make sure that we're also making our network nice and readable. So I'm just going to make sure that this is visible, and we're going to set up curve inputs. I'm going to make sure you don't have to make it all gray like I'm doing. It's just the way I like it. And then this delay until next tick is doing nothing. And this is setting up the session in Houdini. And you can see that as the network gets larger, we may want to start sort of putting more of this logic into functions like I'm starting to do. But I don't want to overuse functions either. So we're going to go create Houdini session. So we've created all of our gizmos, we've created our Houdini session. And now the trick here is we need to know which spline point is associated with which gizmo. Okay, so obviously we have two different splines, and each spline has an index. So this is 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. Like inside of Houdini, we just can't see those numbers just in the viewport like so. We could set up a visualization, but it's going to be a little bit involved and complex. So, okay, we have our spline numbering, but obviously with two splines, that's going to get a little bit confusing because we can no longer just map this array specifically to an individual spline. So, okay, yeah, that's why I wanted to do it based off the current selection, because then we'll just have a one-to-one mapping with the spline points and the gizmo indices in the array. So let's just get rid of this for each loop. And then let's go ahead down here. And now we want to try to have a sort of on selection changed event get set up. And then we want to get the current selection. So, okay, let's just get the selected actors. We're going to get the first selection. We're going to go cast. We're going to say, yeah, then we're going to go and grab that get splines, curve inputs. I'm going to say find item, or even, yeah, contains item, okay. Curve inputs, so we need to cast this to BP spline, which means it's already going to be containing it, so that was completely redundant. So we get selected actors. If it's BP spline, we're going to do something. If it is a BP spline, we're going to create the gizmos from it, okay. And then we need to figure out a way to also destroy gizmos, okay? So if it's not a BP spline, then we need to get our gizmos array, and for each loop, we need to destroy the TRS gizmos, okay? Okay, so this is going to be destroying all the TRS gizmos if we're no longer selecting a valid spline. Okay. But this doesn't handle the case where if we select one spline and then select another spline, we're still selecting splines, but we'll create gizmos first for that spline and then for the next spline. So we need to somehow listen for if the selection has changed. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Then we can say that this was the previous selection. Okay. So we're going to set the previous selection at some point, and we're going to say previous selection matches equals identical. There we go. If the previous selection is identical to the current selection, then we will do nothing. If the previous selection is not the same as the current selection, then we will destroy the TRS gizmos. Okay, just bear with me. And then we will create, and then if, yeah, then we'll, if it's, so then we'll set the previous selection. So if, okay, we get the selected actors. We say, is it the same as the previous selection? If yes, do nothing. If it's not the same, then we'll set a new previous selection to be equal to the selected actors. There we go. And then we will loop over the TRS gizmos and destroy them because the selection has changed. And then, and only then, if this new selection, we're going to grab the first input. If the first input of the new selection is BP spline, then we'll create the gizmos from it. And only then. Okay. So that's our logic for handling the setup of the gizmos, but we need to know when we're going to run this get selected actors. And when we're going to run it is on event script tick. So this means we're going to run it every single frame. Let's have a little look and see what happens. Okay, so by default, the tool hasn't crashed Unreal yet, so that's good. And then if I just go ahead and select BP Spline 2, we can see it's created this spline gizmos. If I now select something else, the spline gizmos are almost all destroyed, okay, apart from the first index, so that gives us a clue about what's wrong. And yeah, so we have a couple of issues to do with the indices. So we're just going to go back over to the tool, and we can see that we currently must be creating a gizmo with a name that is not being found, so is therefore invalid. We're going to dive inside of the create gizmo script, and instead of using the length of the array here, because maybe that's a slightly fallible approach, we're going to just use the current index of the for loop. This also has the benefit of being a bit simpler and clearer to see what's going on. So we're going to go ahead and compile and save that. And let's go ahead and run the tool. Okay, and you can see now, there we go. As we jump between different selections, when we select one of the splines, our gizmos get created. So let's go and get rid of that print string and have a little think about how we can now actually move the spline. So we're creating a gizmo which has the index of the number of the point. So this should be fairly straightforward to deal with. Let's go ahead and make sure that we're just clearing up our graph as we go along. So we can call this little box up here, handle gizmo, handle gizmo lifetimes. There we go. I think that makes sense. And now we want to use another event, which is coming from the overridable functions, and it was on gizmo transform update. And we did already bring it in somewhere, and there it is, event on gizmo transform change. So I'm just going to bring that up to where I'm working on my gizmos. So with the gizmo identifier, we can now get the gizmo array, and we can find the index of the array where that was found. So that gives us the point number that we want to work on. And then we need to just grab our currently selected object. Okay, so that's our previous selection. The naming is maybe a little bit confusing, but that is what it is. So then we're going to get that that element, because we only care about the first element always. And then we're going to cast to BP spline. So this allows us to access the spline from it. So we can get the spline, and we want to get location, or we even want to set location at spline point. There we go. So on gizmo transform changed, we're going to find the index of the point to change. We're going to wire that in, and we're going to change that point index, point location at that index. So I'm going to then wire this in to the BP spline there. Okay, and then we're going to wire in that transform. So just neatening this up a little bit. And we just want to break that because we only care about the location, and we're working in world space. Okay, so there we go. On gizmo transform changed, we're going to update the spline point location. So we can call this update spline, update splines. There we go. And let's go and have a little look and see what we're dealing with. So run the spline tool. We're going to select one of the splines and drag the spline. And we can now see that as we move it, it updates that spline. If we grab the second one, we can do the same over here. It's very nice. And if we just want to now recook those curves, we can hit recook. And after recooking, we see that we get our updated splines on the landscape. So we can go and drag this again, hit recook once more, and everything is working as it should. If we want to add a new spline to the terrain, quick way to do that, so we can just drag out a BP spline. You can see it's going to create the gizmos automatically because we have our new selection. So we pull this out and hit recook now. We should be getting our 3 splines, but we do not get 3. And I'll give you a second to think about why. Well, if you had a look at the curve inputs tab on the left and noticed that our new BP spline 3 hasn't been added to the list, then you would have been absolutely correct. So in order to fix that, we need to go back inside of our tool. And when our selection changes and we've casted to BP spline, we just need to do a little test and see if we have already got that spline inside of our curve inputs. So we're going to get our curve inputs, and we could go and see if the item already exists in there. But there's actually a helpful little function called add unique. And by using add unique, we can just make sure that we do indeed add this spline to the to that group. Okay, so let's go ahead and rerun the tool. You can see that this time it already has picked up the new spline because we also gather all the splines whenever we rerun the tool. So if we hit recook, we're going to get the new one, like so. But we can now go ahead and add a new BP spline, and you can see that straight away it's added that to our curve inputs. So we can pull this out and hit recook once more. Okay. And one thing that you might have noticed, or you will notice if you close and reopen Unreal, is you'll actually lose all of your construction splines. They'll just disappear. The objects will still exist in the world, but the paths that you created will no longer exist. So how do we remedy that? Well, we need to go inside of our BP spline, and we need to just, on the spline itself, we need to toggle override construction script to be on, and input spline points to construction script to be on. And that now means that if we restart Unreal, it's not going to destroy the splines like we see it has here. You can see that even when I toggled those parameters off, we lost the splines. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. So we're going to go ahead and delete all of these. We can open up our tool once more, and I'm just going to drag in a new spline, pull out one of the points, drag in a new spline, pull out one of the points, do the same thing again, pull out one of the points, hit recook. Okay, we get all of our spline points there. And just to test that our construction splines now remain, I save the level, go close the level, open a new one. Oh, and I got a crash, so I'll be right back with you. So I just restarted Unreal, and you can see that we do still retain our construction splines. So the desired effect was achieved. And we're already kind of well on our way to having the system work the way that we want it to. Now, there is one question area, which is what happens if we, interestingly, I need to just go ahead and rehook the pathfinding mesh because we seem to have lost that. So there are a couple of areas. Firstly, if we select multiple splines, you can see we only get the gizmos on the first one. So remember, we're only dealing with the first selection. That's a limitation I'm kind of happy to deal with for the time being. Another limitation at the moment is there's no way to add points to the spline. And that's something that we're going to look at fixing quickly in the next video. And once we've done that, we'll move on to finishing up this tool and calling it a day.